All right, welcome. This is Immigration and Citizenship Attorney Parviz Malakouti. Today is August 18th, 2025, and this is our 27th mobility space. This is a series of 50 mobility spaces that we're doing this year on the hottest topics in dual citizenship, freedom of movement, sovereignty, and of course, passports, which brings us to today's topic. Today, we're talking about passport toggling. Which passport should you use for which purpose? And this is a topic that's come up in bits and pieces in previous mobility spaces. And really, what we're talking about here is the fact that if you're a multiple citizen or if you're in a different situation, we'll go over a few of those scenarios, you may have more than one passport or travel document to travel on. And so, naturally, if you can travel on more than one document, the question arises, which document should you use for traveling to which countries or for which purposes? Or should that even be a consideration to start with? Spoiler alert, I think it should be a consideration, thinking about which passport you use for which purpose, right? So, a couple scenarios, common scenarios that could make it so that a person's in a situation thinking about which passport to travel on. So the first one is the one I mentioned before. A person's a dual citizen or a multiple citizen, and the person has a passport for each one of their countries of citizenship. So if you have two valid passports as a citizen of two countries, then naturally you can have a choice of which passport to travel on to certain countries. And that's scenario number one. Scenario number two, of course, could be if you are just a single citizen, but you have a passport from that country of citizenship, and then you have a non citizenship passport or travel document. So, a document issued by a country that doesn't serve as proof of citizenship. So, this could be a refugee travel document, a Geneva passport, or any one of the other types of documents that we've spoken about on the list of the EU acceptable travel documents for travel to the European Union. That's a second scenario. Third scenario, you could be a single citizen, but you could have two valid passports from your one home country, right? So some countries allow people to apply, so their citizens to apply for more than one passport from their country. The United States is one of these countries. And the reason being that sometimes people need more than one passport from their home country because they're frequent travelers or they're frequent visa appliers and they have to send out their passport for visa stamping, depending on the country and the benefit. That can sometimes take several weeks. In the meantime, those people need to travel and do other things. So some countries allow their citizens to travel. I'm sorry, excuse me, to apply for and have more than one passport at a time. Fourth scenario, which maybe you could include in that third one, is when you have substitute travel documents. So, for example, sticking with the example of the United States, a person can have a U.S. passport and then, of course, a U.S. passport card, right? U.S. passport card, of course, is pretty much only good for overland crossing to Canada or Mexico or closed loop cruises around some Caribbean countries. But if you're an American citizen, you're traveling to Canada or Mexico overland, ostensibly you would have not ostensibly, you definitely would have the option to choose whether to present your passport book, your US passport book, or your US passport card. So those are a few common scenarios that a person could be in that could make them think or make them have the option of deciding which passport that they want to travel on. Now, why does it matter? Why would it matter what passport you travel on? There's a number of reasons, but the way I think about this is to think about the types of information and the types of signals that you're putting out there when you're traveling, right? So the first thing is different passports throw off different types of information in their biographical page. Okay, there's some information that we expect to see from passport holders, no matter what country issues the passport. So typically a photo, typically a date of birth, typically nationality. But there is variability in what's listed on those biographical pages. As we've spoken about before, some passports mention a place of birth and some passports don't. Well, that's a piece of information that's given off, and that could be relevant to you depending on the country that you're traveling to or the purpose you're trying to use that passport. Some passports show their country, excuse me, the location of issuance. Okay, and that combined with a rule in that country that you can only apply for a passport in a country that you're resident in. If you put those two pieces of information together, then that could obviously indicate where you were resident at the time that you applied for that passport. Some passports show the person's occupation. Some passports show the person's father's name, the person's parents' name. So there's variability in the information that's thrown off in the biographical page of different countries' passports. So that's a first consideration. A second consideration is that when you start traveling on different passports, there's different information that's thrown off about you in the pages that have stamps, country stamps, right? That obviously shows a travel history, an explicit travel history, right? That can be an issue, or that could, provide less than ideal circumstances for certain people. Obviously, for me growing up, and I think for a lot of people, there was, there's this scenario. You said, oh, if you travel to this country, for example, you travel to Israel, okay, and then you want to travel to certain Middle Eastern countries, you wouldn't want that Israeli passport stamp to show, when you're entering that other country, right? That was kind of, at least in my childhood growing up, that was kind of like the common example that I always heard about. That's absolutely legitimate. That's a legitimate consideration. Your travel history shows where you've been. It also shows how frequently you travel, right? It gives off information about you. Um, a third type of information that's thrown off, that can be thrown off by passports, is a citizenship that you might have that's intertwined with that passport, right? So obviously, if you have multiple citizenships, and if you exercise citizenship privacy, maybe you don't want to use a passport that clearly states in the biographical page that it is issued to a citizen of that country in this case, right? That gives off information not just about yourself personally, biographical information of your travels, but it obviously gives away where you're a citizen. Okay. The other consideration is that passports have different associations, right? They have different associations, and sometimes people have preferences. They can have preferences about what type of associations they're traveling with. And this can range on the spectrum from just, what's cool, what basically, what type of, I guess vibe or profile you want to give off when you enter a country, both when you're crossing through the border or if you're using that passport for any other purpose, even when you're in the country. And then on the other side of the spectrum, right? Passports can give off a real negative association. If it's issued by a country that is antagonistic to the country you're traveling to, or possibly not antagonistic to that country, but possibly antagonistic to a group of people that you want to deal with in that country when you're traveling. So that's another common consideration, right? Now, here's the thing: people don't necessarily have complete flexibility in deciding which passport that they want to travel on. Some countries exercise what's called the master nationality rule, which basically means that if you're a multiple citizen and you're a citizen of that country, you're treated entirely as if you're only a citizen of that country when you're in that country, meaning your country of citizenship will not recognize. They don't necessarily, doesn't mean they don't, it doesn't mean that they prohibit dual citizenship. It means that they won't necessarily recognize you as a citizen of a foreign country. That's called the master nationality rule. One downstream consequence of the master nationality rule in some circumstances is that some countries will only allow you to travel to that country if you're a citizen of that country on that country's passport. US is a common example of this. Generally, the general rule is that if you're a US citizen, whether you're a multiple citizen or not, you're obligated to enter the United States and exit the United States bearing a valid US passport. We've spoken about this, of course, on previous spaces. If you want to look up the law, it's 8 USC 1185, and then of course there's attendant CFRs, so federal regulations, and I've linked those to the tweet for this space if anybody wants to look those up. Now, these are passports, and there's passport substitutes, valid passport substitutes. The question of how strictly that is enforced is, of course, a question of practicality. What actually happens on the ground, and that's obviously a separate but related question. But technically, that is the rule. If you're an American citizen, you're supposed to enter and exit using a U.S. passport. So that obviously is a restriction for anybody who's an American dual citizen that wants to think about entering the United States or exiting the United States on their other passport from their other country of citizenship. That's one consideration. Other considerations that could restrict basically your ability to decide on which passports to toggle on is if you're depending on citizenship that's intertwined with one passport to be able to enter that country. I'm talking about visa-free access, of course, right? So visa-free access is a benefit of citizenship. It's not a benefit of passports. However, some countries, as part of visa-free agreements, require the citizen of a certain country, in order to avail themselves of that benefit, to enter the country using not just proof of the person's citizenship in the country, but also the passport that's issued by that country. Okay, so in those instances, if you have visa-free access to a country because you're a citizen of another country, you have to also use the passport of that same country that has visa-free access. So that could be one restriction. Another restriction could be if you are traveling on visas, and you have two passports and you have a different type of visa, okay, but in each one of those passports. Well, if you're trying to enter a country under a certain status, for example, you want to study in the United States, or if you want to just be a tourist, well, then that's obviously going to be a restriction. In many cases, you have to enter the country using the passport that bears the visa that you want to avail yourself of the benefits under, right? So these are some of the practical considerations. I wrote a list of considerations yesterday. We also had a great comment from Bit Nomadic. I don't know if he's listening here, either anonymously or not. He also added a number of other great considerations. But these are some of the considerations that people can have and make, and possibly should make, when thinking about what passport to use, right, when they're traveling. So anyway, I think that's a good starting monologue. We're 15 minutes in. Like to open this up for a conversation. Remember, the rules are really, there are no rules. Everybody can speak. Anybody's welcome to speak. Just send me a request if you have something to say. I will approve it right away. You don't have to wait to be invited to speak. If you got an urgent comment to say, cannonball in, send the request, make your comment, and we'll work around it. So let me kick off the first question to Patrick, who is co-hosting this space with me here. So Patrick, I like to go straight to the heart of the matter. Okay, I like to ask the most loaded questions to begin with because it allows you and other people to take it any which way that they like. Okay, so here's my loaded general question for Patrick to kick this off. Patrick, in your opinion, generally speaking, right? And we know obviously there's different profiles and different considerations for different people. We'll go into those. Generally speaking, what are the top 1 to 2 considerations, in your opinion, for a person who has more than one passport in deciding which one of those passports they should use to enter a given country?
Ooh, that is a loaded question because the status on which you're entering a country can be very different. If you're entering a country as a tourist, if you're entering a country as a temporary resident, as a permanent resident, all of those can have different expectations and different timelines. So the passport you want to use is going to be different depending on that. I would say if you're traveling the world as a tourist, I think the information that your passport gives off is the highest among the higher considerations because it has this compounding effect. If you travel to all countries in the world, whatever that number is, 200 plus or minus 5, depending on which countries are recognized at which point in time, uh, you know, the compounding effect is that that some countries are gonna start to give you a hard time if you visit a certain number of countries. You can't really go a lot of places if you've visited North Korea or some pretty extreme examples. But that you there can be less extreme examples too, right? Um, if you have a passport stamp from Kosovo, you might run into issues in Serbia. If you have passport stamp from Pakistan, that's going to raise a lot of red flags in additional countries, but particularly if you do regular trips for business to India. So I think that if you're there for short-term travel, I think that's the highest consideration. If you're there for longer-term travel, if you have a more nomadic lifestyle, I would say you'd want to do a little political analysis as to whether or not that passport and its associated citizenship has a more durable relationship with the country. And let me give you an example. Um, uh, I'm gonna go patience is alpha here because I'm going to use Paraguay as an example. Paraguay is very well marketed as this one-stop shop for non-U.S. citizens to have a domestic, to have a domicile for tax reasons, and it's like very easy to get temporary residency there. But the letter of the law, even though everyone tells you it's unenforced, is that Paraguay does not recognize dual citizenship with a lot of countries. One of the countries it does recognize citizenship with is Italy. Another one is Spain. So if you are a dual citizen of Spain or Italy, it would very much benefit you to have that temporary residency associated with that citizenship and that passport. Now, is that something that you can ask? If you ask people today, hey, does this really matter? And the answer you're going to almost universally get is no. But in a world where visa restrictions or naturalization administrative hurdles keep increasing, I think it probably benefits you to have that conversation with yourself ahead of time and say, hey, if I do Paraguayan residency, I'm going to do it in a citizenship that has much better longer term prospects than any other citizenship, even though in the moment everyone's telling me it doesn't matter. So those are my two speeds on how to decide which citizenship and associated passport to use.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to piggyback on that real quickly with my own thoughts of kind of the hierarchy of considerations, and then I'll go to Alex with the question. So the way I think about there's so many different considerations. We have to place order to these considerations. Okay, how do you weigh the importance of one over the other? I'll start by laying the caveat that every individual's specific analysis trumps all. Okay, so a person's specific consideration trumps all general hierarchies, all general heuristics. But if I had to impose a heuristic to start with, this would be my hierarchy of considerations. Okay, so number one, and most important, are you obligated by law, okay, to enter a given country with a given passport? Okay, I started off talking about the example of U.S. citizens. Okay, uh, consideration number two, so secondary in importance. So these are ordered in order of importance in my view. Does one passport is one passport intertwined with a benefit, okay, that you need in order to enter that country? Okay, that would be, for example, example that I used before. Okay, visa-free access to a country that you have, okay, through one citizenship. That visa-free access requires you to use that passport, and you don't have access to that country using your other passports. Okay. Consideration number three, I have a tie here. Okay. The first part, so 3A would be, are you in a higher chance of physical danger? Okay. Entering one country using one particular passport. Okay. 3B, okay, in my opinion, would be, do you risk the loss of a benefit in another country by using a given passport? Okay. Let me give you an example. Okay. Um, when you apply for asylum in a number of countries, okay, so you make a claim of either persecution at the hands of the government of your home country, or a claim for persecution at the hands of a private individual that the government is unwilling or unable to stop in your home country. When you do that, after you make the claim, availing yourself of the benefits of your home country can be viewed as something you do that nullifies or forfeits or withdraws your claim of asylum. And one way that you can sometimes avail yourself of a benefit of that home country such that it jeopardizes your asylum claim in another country is to either apply to renew your passport under that country's citizenship, or travel on that country's citizenship. Okay. So that would be an example, in my opinion, where using that passport could possibly jeopardize your benefit or pending benefit application that you have in another country. I've had clients with this situation before, right? And they've specifically avoided renewing a passport, even when they didn't have any other citizenship, but renewing and using a passport of the country that they're claiming asylum from. In those cases, they had to apply for a refugee travel document, or a convention document, or Geneva passport, or some sort of other boarding foil, something that to allow them to be able to make the travel that they needed. So that would be consideration 3B, in my opinion. And then consideration four, okay, generally in the fourth category is, the types of information thrown off by those different passports. So what I was talking about at the very beginning, the type of passport information that your biographical page throws off, that your stamps throw off, that basically that a citizenship that's intertwined with the passport that you use might throw off. So that's kind of my general starting point as a hierarchy of considerations when I think about what passport to travel on if you have more than one passport in entering a given country. I want to throw this to Alex. I think it was Alex's suggestion, if I'm not mistaken, for this to be the topic for today. So I want to definitely get Alex's opinions on this. Let me start you off with a question, Alex. Where do you rate the info that's the privacy aspect, the info that's thrown off by using a particular passport? Where do you rate that, Alex, in your hierarchy of considerations for which passports to use?
I think it very much depends on what your personal situation is. I think for me, it's relatively well known that I'm American and born in America. So, depending on how a country views that, it may or may not be a problem. Generally, I don't travel to countries where that may be a problem. And so, usually, I have other considerations in mind. But for some people, if they're born someplace that is highly stigmatized, it may be a huge problem. And giving away personal information, such as place of birth, may be something they want to avoid significantly. So I don't put a huge emphasis on it, but I'm lucky that I don't have a lot of information on my passport that is too jeopardizing in most circumstances. But I could see that other people who do might have more reason to consider what information is shared.
Yeah, well said, Alex, right? Like part of one's decision making here has to do with what information's already out in the ether. Okay. You're open, you have, podcasts and stuff like that out there where you're kind of open about being an American. So revealing that you're American on a travel document to you personally might not be, that big of an issue, right? But for others, it might be more of an issue. What would you put as the top consideration for you? Double two-sided question. What would you put as the top consideration for you? And then generally, what do you think? If there's any difference, what do you think is the general top consideration for most others?
Yeah, so I'm not a passport Chad with 10 passports or anything, so I don't have to worry about this problem very much. But if I were, like I sometimes dream, I think I would prioritize reputation, both from a business and social perspective. So, for example, now I wonder what it's like being an American in Mexico with the trade war and other tensions that are rising, potential US troops going in to take out cartels. I suspect Americans are not being treated as well. So, if I had a country that was very neutral and well respected, say a Swiss passport, I would use the Swiss passport. The Swiss passport is also unique in that it doesn't show your place of birth as well. It shows your canton of origin. So that would be my preferred passport, is one that shows little information and also has a pretty good reputation around the world. So if you're doing business or just checking into a hotel or someplace else like that, no one's gonna spit in your food or treat you differently, etc.
Yeah, you brought up a sore point for me, which is this checking into a hotel. There's a story going around about 47 Israelis whose passports were thrown out in a hotel in, I think it was Bosnia, right? And this to me is just a crazy story, not because of the question of whether it's intentional or unintentional, but just the idea that a document that's so critical for a person, for security, for safety, for privacy, to be able to move around, to escape, could be handed over to an employee of a hotel and kept basically. And that used to be the common requirement in a lot of countries. So if we talk to people of our parents' generation, boomers' generation and older, it was kind of a common thing to check into a hotel and then the hotel would keep your passport. I find that personally totally unacceptable nowadays. I mean, obviously some people are under obligations, to travel to places where that's necessary. But to me, that's to be avoided. Like that's a huge, huge vulnerability. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, you weren't necessarily referring to that, Alex, the hotel keeping the passport, but just checking in with the passport. Yeah, that's a signal that you throw off, right, about yourself and where you're from. And I relayed a story on a previous space. There's no need for me to rehash it, but one of the only times that I had kind of an unpleasant experience checking into a hotel was when I checked in using a passport from a country that just triggered the receptionist there, like to comical levels, to the point I thought she was actually joking. And she had associations with not even just the country, but just the script, okay, the type of alphabet that was on the cover of the passport. And it didn't end up being a huge deal, but it definitely caused an unpleasant situation at the moment. So yeah, point well taken about obviously the geopolitical situation of the country that you're traveling in. um, David, are you
Yes.
are you able to speak, or are you just listening?
Yes, I would love to speak. I have an additional criterion to throw out there that I'd like some feedback on.
Please go ahead.
For somebody who's traveling with multiple passports, that the person may have several different passports that would give visa-free access to a particular country. And this person has traveled to that country before using, let's say, a U.S. passport, but now has access to a greater number of passports that they could use to enter that country. Is the consistency of the use of a particular passport important or unimportant? For example, if I have been visiting Mexico for years as a U.S. citizen using a U.S. passport, but then I later obtain a Mexican passport, and I need to use that to visit some other country in Latin America, for example. Would I be better off being consistent in my use of my American passport to enter that other country, or is it okay if I toggle between my U.S. and my Mexican passport to enter that other country?
Sure.
Obviously, there's a disclosure, a divulgence of the additional passport and potentially citizenship, nationality. But does using multiple passports to enter a particular country at various times, does that get you put on some kind of watch list, perhaps, or raise any red flags?
So I don't think generally the switch is necessarily a net negative. Obviously, you're dealing with additional considerations when you bring in another country, right? You're now implicating that country's relationship with the country that you're either applying for the visa in or traveling to. But the one thing I would say that I notice over and over again in my practice is anytime there's a break in a pattern, a person should be ready to answer questions from either a visa officer or a border officer about why there's the change. So if you travel to, in your example, if you travel to Mexico or any other country using a particular citizenship and that passport, and that's a long history, and then now you're appearing for the 10th visit to that country using a different citizenship and a different passport, I don't think it's necessarily a net negative, but you should be, ready to answer a question or two about the border office, or from the border officer, about, what happened, why you're traveling on that, on that passport. I would say similarly, not just the actual traveling on the passport, but oftentimes a person will have visa-free access to a given country with a particular citizenship, and then they will apply for a visa to that country using their other citizenship that does not have visa-free access. And that can definitely raise questions. And by raise questions, I don't mean like, oh, they're going to be necessarily denied, but sometimes that's just puzzling for the visa adjudicator, because they're just wondering why you would do anything other than take the path of least resistance, or what they think is the path of least resistance, right? Because they don't necessarily know why you're applying for this visa under this second citizenship when you have visa-free access, under the first citizenship. You might know the reason why, right? But they may not know. So they may ask you about it. Anybody else have any other thoughts on David's question?
I'm also curious if using a particular passport in let's say a third-party country, not, in other words, a country where the person is not a citizen, if that has any limitations or constraints on what kind of consular access you may have. For example, if I entered a country on my American passport, but then I wish to avail myself of the Mexican consulate or embassy in that country, would I be able to? Are there any kind of limitations that are imposed based on how you entered a country that's not your own country?
So your question is, if you're a citizen of country A and country B, you travel to country C on country A's citizenship and passport, can you still avail yourself of the consular benefit of country B? Is that the question?
That's right. I'm just curious if there are any limitations on that.
Generally, I definitely know that I've seen, in fact, I've even dealt with situations where a person has entered a country on one citizenship passport and still gotten consular assistance from their second country's citizenship. So I know it can be done. I don't know, I don't know what countries have restrictions or exercise restrictions on that, if at all. So I don't know. That might be, I'm inclined to think not, but that might be a country by country, type of answer.
You could look it up country by country, but from what I've found, most countries, it doesn't matter what passport you enter. As a citizen, you can request consular assistance, but I'm sure there's got to be one country that doesn't work that way at least. So you should check for your passports. But generally, what I've seen is that if you're a citizen, you can get consular assistance. It's even possible, I've read, if you don't even have any passport, as long as you have some way to prove your citizenship status, then they can give you help as well, even if you don't have an up-to-date passport.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well on both counts. Yeah, it's about proving the citizenship. And again, this is part of the reason I'm such a stickler about mentally understanding that these benefits come from a citizenship, not a document. The document is just temporary, rebuttable proof of the citizenship in some cases. But yeah, that's what Alex said has been my experience as well. Generally speaking, right? Your mileage may vary.
Yeah, I'll add a little framework here, and that is that when you enter a country you're typically acquiescing to their security threshold, you are there in the eyes of country C, in this case, as a citizen of country A or B, and that's for the entrance. But when you're in the country, you are still a citizen of multiple other countries. And so to avail yourself of consular assistance, you do need to prove that you are a citizen. But I would also argue if you want to be really proactive, you can always register with the consulate as a guest in that country. You're throwing off more information to multiple countries about where you are, but it's you can register with the consulate if you're going to a very you know a country that has a lot of conflict, so that if something bad happens, uh, y- you know, they know that you're there, and then can provide you with some sort of exit opportunities, and that can be the case for multiple consulates if you are if you're a citizen of multiple countries. Um, it's just we've all heard the story of where like some type of conflict erupts, and then for Americans, the U.S. State Department says, "Oh, we think there's about 100 Americans there, but we don't actually know because there's some issues related to dual citizens." Um, and that typically means that there are estimates that there are Americans there, but they are not registered with the consulate, and they don't know if they were evacuated or got some sort of help through a different country's consulate. So there's all these like levers there, but I think that generally speaking, the consular access is there if you need it, and there's means to be proactive about it if you really want to. But there's, again, as with everything, there's that risk reward between information spent and possible benefit gained.
Yeah, great point, Patrick. And I just want to specify. So my answer was about receiving receiving consular assistance from one of your countries of citizenship. So receiving consular assistance from your country of citizenship whose passport you did not use to enter. The question about, and Patrick kind of alluded to this, the question of how you're treated by the country you're entering is a little bit more thorny, a little bit more complex. There's a concept called operative nationality, right? And the idea is if you have more than one nationality, and I'm using nationality and citizenship interchangeably here. If you have more than one nationality, okay, when you enter a country, in theory, you're operating under one nationality when you enter, right? And sometimes some countries can treat people differently based off of which one of the countries of which their citizenship they were operating on when they entered, which was their operative country of nationality, right? And this can range. I mean, just to give a few examples, I mean, this can range from being able to avail yourself of, treaty benefits, like for example, the E1 or E2 investor treaty, okay, benefit, right? If you want to avail yourself of those benefits, even when you're in the country, you have to have entered the country using the passport and the citizenship of the country that's a member of the treaty. Another example is temporary protective status. Okay, it's a temporary status for people that are from countries that are kind of in crisis. And sometimes a person, let's say they're a Haitian or a Venezuelan or a Syrian. Some of these people are dual citizens, right? And the question of whether they can avail themselves of a TPS designation by the United States of a particular country, right, has to do with whether they were operating under whether that was their operative nationality when they entered the country. So the latter, the question of how the country you're traveling to treats you or might treat you differently based off of which of your two, or three or whatever citizenships you use to enter is a little bit more thorny, right? And that's that can get really, really detailed. Basically, I don't know if I'd feel comfortable having like making like a big blanket statement on that. But yeah, I agreed with Patrick and Alex, especially on the consular assistance question. David,
I got a quick question here,
Thank
and
you.
maybe now's the appropriate time. Can we talk about like just a very tactical example of toggling between two passports, specifically passports, um, as a dual citizen, um, as to when and where you can use it at the specific like security thresholds or immigration thresholds on a trip. So in this example, we'll say we'll leave LAX and we're going to Rome, and someone is a dual citizen American in the EU. You can't, you have to leave, you have to enter and leave the United States as a US passport holder, as a US citizen, but the passport you have to use that you clear with the airline is the same one that you have to use at gate if they're checking passports at the gate check. But then when you arrive to the new country, can you use a different passport at that security threshold, one that might be more convenient, like your EU passport that gives you, indefinite entry and also presumably a faster track, wait time at, you know, immigration. Can we talk about how that works? Because I know that, and I only bring that up because I had a close friend of mine who, upon receiving their European citizenship by descent, used the incorrect passport at the airport. Um, at the wrong time, they toggled between them incorrectly, and it created quite a security scene at the gate of the airport. And so maybe we talk a little bit through that, because I know that different information is collected at different points and has to be consistent at certain points of that example I used them not.
yeah, absolutely. I think you framed up the issue pretty well, the question pretty well. Yeah, I mean, what do you want to talk about specifically? When the person bears the second passport, or what?
Yeah. So in this case, it's the stakes are higher for if there is, a a master citizenship rule in play. That's why I use the American example here. But if you're traveling and you're leaving from the United States, you have to enter in your passport information with your air carrier. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a whole lot of super high value air carriers that go from LAX to Rome. I think it's just American Airlines and Alitalia or something. But can you enter in your EU citizenship on your plane ticket reservation? Therefore, once you get to the airport and you're leaving the US, can you use your EU passport from then forward? Or is that technically using a EU citizenship to leave the United States, which breaks that master citizenship rule?
From then forward, meaning when you've arrived in the European Union, you said, Patrick?
Well, either from, in this example, LAX, because you're plugging that information into your ticket reservation and it's associated with your ticket, or is the first time you use it at the immigration in Rome?
Good question. So I'm not sure that I've seen somebody try to use the EU passport in your example at LAX. That's what you're asking, right? Can you actually use the passport exiting the United States? Is that your question?
Yes.
I'm not sure if it can be used that early. I don't know. I don't know. The typical scenario that I kind of think about is it's not think about, but that I consider is basically when you're leaving one country, and you're passing out of their control. So you're going through exit control in that country using using the passport that you use to enter that country if it's not one of your countries of citizenship, or in the United States case using the U.S. passport, and then presenting the second passport, the second location. I don't know if you can use use the European Union passport as early as you mentioned. That might be a good thing to look into.
In my example of a friend who accidentally, got into a security kerfuffle. They had just received their EU citizenship by descent. They booked their ticket with their U.S. passport, left with their U.S. passport. As soon as they got to the gate and were doing the gate checks, they got really excited because they had their new citizenship by descent passport, and they used their EU. They used that EU passport at the gate, and typically sometimes you'll see a small sticker on the back of a passport. It's usually like a pre-clearance sticker of security, or that they're tagging that passport as the one that you're passing through TSA or exit control. But since he got to the gate, it didn't match up with what they had on the record, and it didn't have that security tag on it. And so suddenly they said, "Hey, do you have two passport? Are you do you have two passports from two different countries?" And they had like two or three guys from immigration come and check it out, because that's a lack of control, and so they're attempting to control security there. So that's what prompted the question, because
Mm-hmm.
I know that in that example, it's incorrect to toggle between citizenships in a situation like that. I just didn't know if that situation would have been better if the EU citizenship was kept in his pocket until Europe, or if he should have just started with it on the reservation. But I was
So to be clear, your friend used the U.S. passport for the plane reservation, used the U.S. passport to get to the gate, and then when he got to the gate, he presented the EU passport
yes.
in order to. Yeah, exactly. Okay, understood. Yeah, I presume I always presumed that as the last step, he has to board the plane using the same passport that he used on his reservation, and using the passport that he passed through the exit control in. So yeah, to answer your question, I would think he would have been fine if he had boarded the plane with the U.S. passport and then arrived to Europe using the other passport, the European Union passport.
Okay, that's exactly what I thought. But I just thought with a hyper tactical example, it would kind of sort through the use case scenario.
Yeah. By the way, I will say this. So, if doing so, he may be asked at the European immigration control if he exited the United States using the European passport. What I've seen typically is if you toggle between passports traveling between countries, oftentimes when you arrive to the second country, you're asked, and presumably the border control person is looking at the information on your plane manifest. You're asked whether you exited the previous country using the passport that you're now presenting to them. So that's like a common dynamic, a common question that comes up, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it also reminds me to mention here that if you're entering, in this example, the EU with an EU passport, you presumably would fill out your customs form with that EU passport number, as opposed to the American passport number you left with.
I had a friend who exited on his American passport one country and tried to enter the new country on a different passport. And the border agent was like, you can't enter on this passport. You have to use the one on the flight. So if you want to enter on the second passport, you have to tell the airline that this is the passport you want to enter with so that they can put it in the flight. I don't know if that was just him, the immigration officer, being lazy, or if that's the actual rule in the country, but just some anecdotal data.
Yeah, I've had that happen before as well. Part of the reason is because, as we know, airlines face stiff penalties if they let somebody travel to a certain country and that person's not able to enter that country, right? So one of the things, one of the dynamics is that certain citizenships and passports will require proof of onward travel, right? Generally, it's good to have some sort of proof of onward travel, right? When you're traveling as a tourist to a particular country. However, the stringency of that requirement is often treated differently based off of what country citizenship and passport you're traveling on, right? So I've actually personally had that happen before as well, which is, if I were to enter a country under one citizenship and passport, I would not have to show proof of onward travel. But if I were to enter on the citizenship and passport I wanted to, then I would be tasked with providing the proof of onward travel. So just like Alex said, that was something that I can't remember if I was explicitly asked upon check-in at the airline counter, or if I just brought it up myself. But I disclosed that I would be entering that other country on this other citizenship and passport. Okay, we got Romesh Ganohariti here, joining for the very first time. And Romesh is an academic. He's a PhD. And what do you know? One of his specialties, his subspecialties, is emerging nation states. And as part of that, he talks about and writes about and researches a lot about passports. And we're happy to have him here. Ramesh, let me see here. Ramesh, can you speak? Can you hear us? Ramesh, the microphone button is in the bottom left-hand corner.
All right, super. Hi, everyone. Uh, just kind of to jump in on a couple of points that also I think Patrick raised as well about leaving with the US and coming to the EU on two passports. I think what's important to keep in mind is that to differentiate between what passport you show immigration versus what passport you show the check-in desk on the and the gate agent, because it can really be two different things. So in the case of the US, it would be that when you go check in to drop off your bags, you would show your European passport, and then you go through US immigration if there is actually physically any immigration, and then again at the gate you'd show your European passport, and then you'd really repeat the thing in reverse when returning to the US, so from Europe. So that's kind of this way I've been made aware of how it works in terms of toggling between the passports. And also in the EU, at least in the Netherlands, I know, for example, if you are a dual citizen and and you're not an EU national at the same time, so you have an EU residency permit, but you have two other nationalities from the US and, I don't know, India, for example, then actually for the European or the Dutch immigration officials, it doesn't really matter which passport you enter the EU on, because for them, what's more important is the fact that you have a residency permit and the passport is of secondary importance. So that's what I've been told as well. Thanks.
Do you know if that changes if your passports have different names on them?
So it doesn't, because at least in the Dutch case, I'm not sure how other EU countries approach it, but at least in the Dutch case, what they are mainly going off of is what's printed in your residency permit. And as long as something coincides, so sometimes not all countries print all the names. In some countries only print the first name and the last name, while other countries print all your names. It shouldn't really matter. It doesn't really matter as long as kind of your main names are correct. If it's a spelling issue, that I'm not 100% sure how it works in the residency permit. But if it's multiple names, you don't have to have all your names listed in the passports correctly, fully.
Alex, people enter the United States with different spellings on of names on different documents. Generally, if U.S. authorities can identify it's the same person, it's typically not that big of an issue. The person might be questioned or get some questions of, get questioned about it, but it's typically not that big of a deal for entering the United States.
Good to know.
Yeah, and then just to piggyback on a second thing that Romesh said. So, the way I think the way you have to think about passports is when you're thinking about the benefit of entering a country, the ability to enter a country, what's the source of the benefit, right? So if you're resident in a country, if you have a residency permit in a country, and you also have a citizenship in another country, okay, that offers visa-free access to that country you have a residency permit in, right? Well, how are you entering, or how are you trying to enter the country, right? If you have a residency permit, okay, then it's less important to show that you're a citizen of a country that has that gives you visa-free access there, because you're entering the country as a resident, right? And I think I mentioned this earlier in the space, right? You could have two visas. I'm sorry, you could have two passports issued by two different countries you're a citizen of, right? That have two different levels of access to a third country, right? Either tourist visa and student visa, or a tourist visa and then later like a residency permit. And sometimes, I mean, this is country by country, but sometimes the country requires you to enter using the passport that bears the visa that has the status that you're trying to enter under, right? So, for example, common example, and this might be interesting to some people that are listening to this call. Entering the United States, okay, you might have a citizenship that's a member of the that's part of the ESTA program, okay, so the visa free access, and you might have citizenship in a country that's not part of ESTA, okay. Well, with the citizenship and attendant passport of the ESTA country that you're citizen of, let's call it France, okay, for example. Obviously, you can sign up for electronic authorization. If you're approved, you can enter the United States for typically up to 90 days at a time. You might also have a citizenship and a passport in another country. So I don't know, let's call it Morocco, okay? And you can apply for a visa to the United States using that citizenship and passport in Morocco. So if you apply for a B2 tourist visa, I don't know how long they're issued for to Moroccan citizens, but I don't know, let's say it's 5 years. I don't know if it is, but let's say it's 5 years. And let's say you have a B2 tourist visa and your Moroccan passport validity for 5 years. You have two different paths to enter the United States as a tourist, right? However, the visa waiver program explicitly states that if you want to enter visa-free under the visa waiver program, you must not only be a national of a program country, but you must have the passport from that country, right? To enter, you must enter bearing that country's passport. Other countries don't necessarily treat it this way. Okay, so I posted an example posted by the European Union in I forget the citation, the legal citation. I'll find it after the space and link it below so people can read it. But the example was a person who's a citizen of a country that has visa-free access to Sweden, okay, but traveling under a passport not issued by that country. So in this example, it was Colombia, okay, Colombian citizen traveling to Sweden as a Colombian national, but not bearing a Colombian passport, okay, would that person be able to enter visa-free access? And let me add, and the passport that they're traveling under, okay, does not give visa-free access to Sweden. The question was, would that person be able to enter visa-free to Sweden? And the answer given in the example was yes, they could, okay, because the nationality provided visa-free access to the Colombian, even if they were traveling on a non-Colombian passport. So different countries and unions have different rules about whether it's not just that you have to have the right citizenship, but whether you have to have the right passport as well, or whether it's acceptable to be a citizen of a country that has visa-free access and have something that proves that you're a citizen, even if it's not a passport. Okay, we're going. So, wow, an hour passed by super quickly. It's 11:57. We've been going for about 55, 56 minutes here, right? As a reminder, I switched these spaces down to a default time of 1 hour. I can go a little bit longer if we have a really bumping conversation. I reserve the right to extend to, an hour 15 or an hour and a half. But generally, our default is to go for about an hour. Anybody else have any other comments, questions, or scenarios they want to talk about before we wrap this up and talk about a topic for a future space?
I had a question in relation to, for example, the EU. If you have two nationalities, let's say the US and Colombian, which both give access to the EU visa free, can you then potentially stagger your 90 days in 180 days consecutively? Because I know if you have a residency permit and you are, for example, from the US and your residency permit lapses, you can indeed stay for another 90 days after the fact using that visa free access, right? But if you have two non-EU nationalities with visa free access, how does that work? Does anyone know?
I can chime in here. For the Schengen access, it's 90 days across any 180-day period, regardless of the document you use to enter. It's per individual, not per citizenship / document.
Well, I think it depends if you're not using bilateral treaties, right? There are some countries that allow people from certain countries to stay more than 90 days as well. So that could complicate things.
Correct. I think it's Bulgaria or something like that has like one of those Eastern European state. If you enter there, I think but on a general basis, it's no, you cannot just run. I know because during COVID, a lot of Americans tried to essentially just go the Schengen area and just recycle their entry like visa runs, but yeah, cannot.
Yeah, and this is a non-EU example, but I know that a lot of Americans generally retired Americans who live in Western Panama, in the Boquete David area, historically didn't get residency. The American passport allows them to stay there 180 days per 300 per year, but they would do a visa run to Costa Rica and come back and put a $20 bill or whatever in their passport, so they could just do a visa run and recycle and be in the country 180 days at a time, irrespective of the letter of the law, which was 180 days per year. They would just do 180 days at a time. So I do think that the EU is a lot better at enforcing those rules. And in other places in the world, there exists this enforcement gray area that is not super dependable, but some people still work around it.
Yeah, the United States is a little bit different. It's not, United States doesn't give to ESTA holders like 90 days in any 180. It's if the person enters and is given the full 90 days, that just means a 90-day stay. So they can leave and then try to come back. Now, like visa runs, as Patrick said, I've had people consult with me and ask, okay, well, how long do I have to stay outside the United States after I use my whole 90 days before I come back in? There's no hard and fast rule. There's no statutory rule. There's no rule in the regulations. But the rule of thumb that I use, again, rule of thumb doesn't mean it, it obviously can be adjusted upwards or downwards based off a person's personal circumstances. But I say you should be out for as long as you were in before you try to come back. So if somebody comes to the United States, on the visa waiver, maxes the entire 90 days, okay, which I don't recommend, and then they leave, I would recommend that they leave they stay out for at least 90 days before they try to come back in. So, that type of system, as opposed to the EU, allows for the possibility of more gaming, right? But it also can come with higher consequences, right? Because if you try to enter the United States and then you're denied, then that could be a refusal that can actually jeopardize your future immigration or visa applications to the United States. So in a way, I mean, all other things being equal, I kind of tend to prefer the systems that are more explicit, just numerical calculation of exactly how much time you can spend in the country, rather than kind of this hand wavy thing about whether you can come back after a certain period of time that you've been outside of the country or not. Okay, one other just quick scenario that I'll basically add on to what I was mentioning before. A lot of people don't know that it can actually be much more advantageous to enter a certain country using a visa, even a tourist visa, rather than visa free, right? First example is because the obvious one. Sometimes when you get a visa to a certain country, you're given a stay with a possibility of a stay that's much longer than what you just get visa free, based off of the citizenship, right? So you could get 6 months continuous stay instead of 3 months, or a 3-month continuous stay instead of 2 weeks if your citizenship only gives you 2 weeks, for example. But another potential benefit in certain circumstances, and this is the case in the United States, is that sometimes entering on a visa allows you to actually renew, extend your status from within the United States or the country, whatever the country is, without leaving. Okay, whereas sometimes if you enter visa free, you don't have the ability. You're unable to either extend your status or lateral over. In the United States, we call it change of status. Okay, but basically change status to a different type of status. So sometimes there's more flexibility entering a country on a visa that you actually applied for and schlepped to the embassy to go to an interview for, rather than just the visa-free access or the electronic travel authorization that you get pursuant to being a citizen of a particular country. So I would add that as a consideration as well to what we were talking about before, decision of which passport to use if you have multiple passports and enter in a given country.
I would also add that the reverse of the EU can be true, where in some countries, if you have residency and you don't enter on your residency, the citizenship and passport connected to your residency, then you could potentially have issues with your residency. Maybe it could even be revoked. So that's something to keep in mind, is that different countries have different views of how you can enter if you're a resident there. And if you enter on a passport that's not affiliated with your residency, you could potentially have problems. So that's something to consider when toogling as well.
Yep, that's definitely a consideration as well. Highly country specific, but that's absolutely right. Okay, 12:05 Pacific Standard Time right now. We've been going for an hour and 3 minutes. Space number 28. Well, first of all, does anybody have anything else they want to add, or any other topic? And I have a feeling we're going to have to revisit this topic because there's a few questions that are kind of unresolved, right? That I think could probably benefit from some additional research and who knows, maybe an experiment or two. So yeah, I think we'll be revisiting this topic in a future space. But for now, is there anything else that somebody wants to mention, ask, or talk about? Okay. So mobility space number 28 is going to be Thursday, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, as per our usual time. I typically put up a poll with 4 topics that I think are interesting for the next topic. But as always, I ask the participants. So participants, do you have any topic that you'd like to speak about for our next space? Okay, nobody in particular. Okay, so just taking from what we were considering last time, we were considering talking about the U.S. visa bond pilot program, which requires a visa bond of $15,000 for B2 tourist visa applicants from countries that have high overstay rates. That was one topic that we were considering. Another topic we were considering is birthright citizenship. We're definitely going to have to hit that one. That's no doubt. The question is, should it be the next one? And then the other topic that we were considering was passport validity periods. The 5 years versus the 10 years. Considerations, why it matters, how somebody should deal with the issue if they have passports from countries that issue those different validity periods. Those were the 3 big topics. We already spoke about that one. Anybody have a preference for one of those 3, or should I just put up a poll with all of my suggestions and let the interwebs take care of the topic?
I think we should do a poll. Let La Gente decide.
Okay, Patrick votes for the poll. Okay, that's what we'll do then. Okay, I want to thank everybody who participated. Romesh Ganohariti, Patrick McFawn, Alex Ogorji, David Bindell, and of course, all of our anonymous listeners who are creeping in the background. We appreciate you. We will have our next mobility space on Thursday, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Topic TBD today. So make sure you check my profile for the poll and cast your vote about what you want to talk about or hear about. Have a great one, everybody. Have a great week.